Today I present you with another review of a classic vintage game. This time we talk about Lankhmar, published by TSR in 1975 and designed, or at least with the heavy involvement of Harry Fisher and Fritz Leiber. So a writer that participates to the creation of a board game based on his own creations, because Lankhmar as any fantasy reader probably has already figured out, is based on the story of Fafhrd and the Grey Mouser by Leiber. The original idea Leiber has credited to Fisher, but then it was Leiber who wrote most of the stories. Now, it fascinates me because TSR had just created D&D, and D&D owed a lot to Fafhrd and the Grey Mouser, and it wasn't a secret. Gygax acknowledged the debit that the creation of D&D had with Fafhrd and the Grey Mouser in the foreword of the first edition of D&D. Which makes perfect sense. It makes perfect sense that it would be the stories of Fafhrd and the Grey Mousers, which were so much about individual interest, pursuit of glory and wealth, and joy of adventure, that would be a source for Dungeons and Dragons and RPG, much more, say, than Tolkien, where the individuals are part of a much bigger landscape. They are pretty much embodiment of a metaphysical struggle between good and evil. Fafhrd and Grey Mouser is about going out there, having a good time, hanging out with your buddies, slaying a couple of monsters, stealing one thing here, one thing there, and trying to enjoy life, which doesn't always work, and very often there is a vein of melancholy. But the idea is individualism, is joyful individualism. And so it's no surprise that Dungeons and Dragons RPG games where you become another individual would come from this sort of vision. Other sources, similar sources, are John Carter of Mars and Conan. So again, we are about individualism. What fascinates me so that Fafhrd and the Grey Mouser were one of the inspirations for Dungeons and Dragons, and soon after, then the producers of Dungeons and Dragons also sponsored a board game based on one of the sources, on the world of Lankhmar, populated by the likes of Fafhrd and the Grey Mouser. Now, D&D and role-playing game, because D&D was the first one, came out of wargaming. That was the other source. It was pretty much actually when wargaming met the narrative that RPG as an activity was created. When wargamers that were playing the Circles or the Twin Cities in the late 60s, together with Dave Arneson, one of the co-creators of D&D, started experimenting with new innovations and ideas, such as having an omnipotent referee that over time took on the role of the narrator, that later became the Dungeon Master, playing individuals instead of groups, legions, regiments, platoons, having customizations, having long campaigns, and campaigns that creates not a military campaign, but the biography of a character. So role-playing games detach themselves from board gaming. That's where they came from. But interesting enough, in Lankhmar, as you will see, we have almost a return to the sources, because Lankhmar is a hybrid between an adventure role-playing game, or should say an adventure game that owes a lot to the early role-playing games, and at the same time it is a war game. They try to put together both sides, to have a war game and an adventure RPG-ish game. They tried to put together the best of both worlds. Did it work? Did they succeed? Well, stay tuned, and I'm gonna show you how the game works, and then we're gonna talk about the merits and possible dark sides of the design. Here you see the map for the game. There are reflections there, and that's because I put the map on the piece of plexiglass so that I could lay it flat and I could move it around. I could move the board around without having to mess up the pieces that I had set up It looks pretty good for its age, and I must say, it could be an interesting reading aid for people that are fans of the Fafhrd and Grey Mouser's stories. Definitely, this map looks better than those small black and white maps that you had in the opening sections of the old editions of Leiber stories. So, well, it has that use there. As a map, it is an it's an hexagonal map divided in X's. Lot of it is taken by sea, and there will be boats that you can use to move from one area to the other, but still this of course restricts movement quite a bit. Here there is a land that goes up and down every 10 turns, it emerges and then it goes back at the bottom of the sea again. This desert occupies a large area of this side of the map. You can pass it, but there are penalties. Yeah, you have forests, and here you have a chain of mountains that has only a small passage there and a small passage there. And again, it is possible to move across the mountains, but it's just so disadvantageous, just like it is disadvantageous to move across the desert unless you have camels, that in most cases the map dictates what is the most logical direction to move. That is to say, it's a large map and you think, oh my gosh, so many possibilities. In reality, there are just so many bottlenecks that it's almost like a point-to-point map. If it was a point-to-point map, you would barely notice the difference. In this game, there are 4 sides, 4 parties, 4 nations, 4 groups, whatever you want to call them, that each of them has a citadel, which is the capital. There is one there, one there, one there, and one right there. You can maybe see it under the reflection. The point of the game is to take control of the citadels of the opponent. If you conquer all the citadels of your opponent, you win the game, and this is the only victory condition. Each side in the game starts with 8 soldier units, a hero, and a special weapon for that hero. So for example, this side here represents the Mingles with Fafhrd and his great axe. If you have 4 players, then each player takes a side. 2 player, each player takes 2 sides. 3 players, you ignore one of the sides, and each player takes one of the remaining 3. Weapons. At the beginning of the game, your soldiers receive weapons, and as you can see from this section of the rulebook, the combination of weapons that the sides receive is different. So that is good because it gives the sides a slightly different flavor. Some sides will have bows and arrows, some other ones will not, will be better in short range combat, and so you have different combinations there. The weapons are represented by counters, a lot of them, and these counters must be assigned to individual soldiers, which means that these soldiers will be sitting at the top of wobbly piles of counters representing the weapons that are carried by each. See, for example, I'm not even pretending that it's hard. We can't even put together a stack. So for example, this soldier has a spear, say a spear, and a sword. I'm not even checking if this is correct for these people. It's just to show you how this may work. And we give a sword and a bow and 2 arrows to another guy. And voila. Different weapons have different advantages and disadvantages. Some have better range, but maybe they're not as good at hitting, and so on and so forth. So your people will be resting atop these wobbly piles of tokens, and the weapon which is visible on top is the weapon that they currently have. If you want them to use another weapon, then you have to take an action to change the order in the stack. If you're firing an arrow, then you need to move the arrow out of the pile. You throw it at your opponent, and it stays there, and the opponent may pick it up. Somebody else may pick it up. It just looks a little funny that way. Now, when you hear the turn sequence, it seems pretty traditional wargaming fare, because in most cases what happens each turn is that a player moves any and all or none of their units, of these units, and then you can fight if you are in range of enemies. Now, we're told in the rules that these counters do not represent individuals, they represent large groups, they represent formations, but as you play the game, definitely you have the feeling that they feel more like they act as individual soldiers. When you are when you activate them for movement, they receive movement points depending on the type of unit that they have. Most units, again, the main units are your heroes and the warriors. They have 9 movement points, 6 movement points. And something that is good is there's a flexibility because you can spend movement points to do different things. But here's when things start looking a little funny. Because it costs a movement point to cross a clear terrain area, and these hexes represent miles and miles of land. And then it costs, for example, well, you can see 2 movement points to engage in offensive combat. You're preparing, you're slowing down as you approach the opponent, that's fine. But it takes a movement point to change weapon. That is really weird that this individual or these 500 people would take just to sheath their sword and pick up a spear would take as long as it would take them to cover 40-50 miles. I mean, that must be a very convoluted weapon that you have there if it takes so long for you to rearrange it. Retrieving or picking up a weapon, again, those must be very heavy because it takes a movement point. Entering a boat, a movement point. Mounting a beast, how tall are those beasts? That just to get on a darn beast, that is to get your people on horses or camels, it costs 2 movement points. As you can see, things start looking funny because these things would make sense if we were talking about tactical combat, and basically these movement points represent segments of time of just 10 seconds, 20 second tops. But when they seem to represent days of travel because they can be spent to travel long distances, then it just feels funny. Then you have a mix between tactical time and strategic time. And something like this happens also when you have combat. Why? Here we go. Combat, a lot of these weapons have range. And yeah, we got an enemy in there just to give you a sense. Most of these weapons have range. Now, there are different combat tables which are buried in the rulebook only. If you don't have a play raid, that's to be expected, that's fine. Combat tables depending on who is fighting against whom. This really feels very RPG-ish. Heroes versus warriors, warriors versus heroes, which is the worst possible odds, and heroes versus heroes or warriors versus warriors, kind of like the same thing. Now, look at the ranges though. The sword can hit at adjacent or 1. Distance 1 means one intervening hex. That's the sword. A sword, the epitome of the melee combat. It can attack at an intervening hex. Okay, with lower chances of hitting. But this is a very long thrust. Again, in tactical combat, that's okay. It simulates the thrust, the fact that there's a quick attack and then retreating where the attacker was originally, so we don't do the weird thing of moving and going back immediately. But on these distances, that just makes no sense. Are you throwing? Okay, it's a raid, I imagine. I'm going, attacking, and then going back exactly where I was. But why? Why would I be able to go somewhere else? There is a range of 1 intervening hex, so we probably today we call it range 2 when you're using a sword. And it gets just worse when you look at other weapons because the axe or the spear get up to a range of 2, which again means 2 intervening hexes. That's just the spear, and yes, you guessed it, if you're firing with an arrow or a sling, then you have up to 3 intervening hexes. And that's just like a quarter of the planet. But you need to have line of sight, we are told. You cannot fire, for example, across mountains. You can fire 120 miles, 130 miles, 50 miles away, but not across mountains. Weird. Tactical spaces, tactical distances on a strategic map. It really looks funny. And again, when you have these things, it really feels like these were designed with man-to-man combat in mind, applied to pieces that we're told represent large groups of individuals. So again, you have man-to-man ideas, man-to-man combat ideas applied to a war game that appears to be at the strategic or operational level. Now, when you are fighting, you roll a die. There are sometimes modifiers, but not many. When you take modifiers into account, you roll the die and you cross-reference the modified result with the weapon and range that you're using on the table that applies, and you see if it's no result, then of course it's self-explanatory, or if you inflict 1 or 2 hits. 2 hits is rarely used because pretty much 2 hits, if you're fighting any piece other than a hero mounted on a beast, that piece is killed with two hits, as well as the beast mounted upon. If a mounted hero, the beast is killed and the hero is wounded. Which means with a hit you kill an enemy piece, and with a hit you wound one of your heroes. You need a piece of paper to record that because there are no tokens to keep track of that. And there is an optional rule that says that wounded heroes may also be able to heal. So combat in reality is extremely brutal because you travel a lot to set up a situation, and then these die rolls are extremely brutal and unforgiving. Half of your pieces may be destroyed in a single attack, and also this is important because when you're attacking, you also give the opponent a chance to attack back. For each attack that you perform, the opponent gets to attack back to attack the attacking unit back. That is, each unit can attack only once, but the attacked unit can counterattack as many times as necessary to respond to all attacks. Also, terrain. If a defender is defending in a citadel, there is a steep penalty for the attackers, which means you're traveling across the world to throw your soldiers at the walls of the opponent and see so many of them completely slaughtered. I think there may be other things that give flavor to this otherwise pretty excessively straightforward situation. March, die at the walls of the opponent, the end. Well, the other game effects that are supposed to give more flavor and story to the entire experience are based on quests. There are places on the board where you may receive quest cards, these cards here, the GS cards, and some are blank, and I wonder if they're meant to be blank so you can write your own special effects, or they're meant meaning you go for a quest and there's no quest, so to represent the unpredictability of the world. These cards are written extremely small font. You can read them well now, but just to give you a sense of how small the font is compared to a traditional war game counter. That's really small stuff. So you will have an instruction of something, some task that you need to perform to complete that quest. Go to the city and bring back a gold friend for Ningobble. Now, there isn't anything specific. It's simply a little bit of window dressing to say go to the city and then go back to Ningobble, take 4 steps upon the steps. Oh gosh, so many. Here we go. Cross the inner sea and then return where you were before. Go to the Great Forest, etc., etc. So you can perform these quests. Sometimes they're assigned to you randomly. Every 5 turns, each side gets one of these quests, and you have to assign it to one of your people. And here, brace yourself for it, because I need to quote from the rulebook or you won't believe me. How you handle a quest once you receive it. Here we go. While every reasonable effort must be made to fulfill a GIAS, it need not actually be completed if an honest attempt has failed. The famous and very straightforward and completely unambiguous concept in wargaming of honest attempt. For example, if a warrior assigned to a geas is killed in the process, this certainly constitutes an honest attempt and failure. A hero sent to such a goal may retreat after being wounded in combat, for he has put forth a sincere effort. So you can imagine, if you're playing competitively, you have to demonstrate your honesty, or to, it's just, how do you, honest attempt is not a game concept. You need to quantify it, you need to have some other form of system to evaluate a little more objectively. In a role-playing game that works, narrative game that works, storytelling game that works, adventure game or war game, not so much. If you succeed in your Geas quest, then you get a reward, and you simply draw the card and you read the corresponding reward. Again, a lot of these cards are blank, and I wonder if it's just a lot of work that you get and then you don't get a reward, or it's supposed to be there to so that you can customize. You can customize your cards, your deck of rewards. This is how it works. As I said in my intro, they tried to put together the best of both worlds, and I think actually they got the worst of both. The wargaming elements get in the way of the RPG element, and vice versa. And what comes out is just a clash of things that do not go together. If you watch my main segment, you should know it's a game where you have tactical actions on a strategic map. So it looks like people are enormous giants that are throwing axes or hitting with their sword 80 miles away. You have a mix of tactical movement in a strategic segmentation of time, so that picking up a sword takes the same time as it takes to travel miles and miles and miles. It just feels weird, and so that is bad enough. But again, one wonders, why did that happen? Wasn't that obvious? And the rules do say, well, there is a degree of abstraction, of course. No, of course not. That's not in the 70s. The idea behind wargaming was already that yes, you have abstraction, but that you choose one of the frames of reference, strategic, operational, tactical, and you use the abstraction as a way to convey reality, to mirror that. So here the abstraction wasn't meant to convey even the world of Fafhrd and the Grey Mouser, because that's people are not that big or don't travel that much and don't throw axes that far in that world. What was attempted here, the abstraction, was to try to put together, in my opinion, and the adventure element and the wargame elements, to give you some individual elements, mix them together with the general element of the wargame, and what came out is this like mess that is completely unconvincing. Now, okay, suppose that you go past entirely that. Okay, we retweak, we retheme the game into a sci-fi game. How about that? Where we do have, say, you need to reprogram your weapons, and it does take a day or two to figure out a way through the shields of the opponent. Where you can throw missiles, then it's okay that they go that far. Would it work? And in that sense, this wouldn't be, even if you retheme it and you weren't just annoyed by the shifting in the scale, this would still be a pretty weak game. Because the movement of the map is not that interesting, because the rules are so ambiguous, they leave so much to the imagination, which again, if it's a role-playing game and you have a dungeon master that is helping you figure out and making the decisions, here's ambiguity is that one thing. When you have two wargamers that want to get competitive and try to figure out whether they have been making honest efforts or not, is not that fun. A lot of the rules are terribly fiddly. I didn't even get into the rules concerning naval movement. That's like a page and a half in an otherwise short rule book, just disproportionately detailed, and at the end you're still confused because many passages. Dismounting comes up with its own set of problems once you start playing. All these fiddly details, logistically, mechanically, physically, having these stacks of counters just feels strange. I could go on and on and on just unpolished production. I had to say, okay, you can blame it. Well, that was back in the day. The art of wargaming wasn't all that developed. Even by the standards of the day, this is a product that feels unpolished, rushed, and again, weakened by its ambition. which is a laudable ambition, which is a beautiful ambition. Yes, to try to bring back the new innovations that RPG had created, bring them back into board games. Have a narrative board game with a thematic depth, with a beautiful background story, with adventures, with interesting individuals. It just doesn't work because, again, the wargaming element gets in the way of the story element and vice versa. Did I enjoy playing this game? No, not at all. Very little, at least. But I'm glad I did. I'm glad I did play it because it is an interesting failure to me. It's historically interesting. I'm interested in the history of gaming and different game philosophies. So to me, this is fascinating because if you look at D&D, and then I look at D&D board games that we have these days, Wrath of Ashardalon, Castle Ravenloft, Temple of Elemental Evil, Legend of Drizzt. Those are games that are robust games. Some people like it, some people don't, but they're robust games that clearly have a very consistent philosophy. They really want to go for the adventure, the individual experience, the tactical element, etc., etc. Which seems obvious to us. D&D is like that. Go down a dungeon, slay monsters, and grab some treasure. The D&D games are like that. If we did not look at history, if we did not look at intermediate steps, it would seem too easy. We would get an idea that actually starting from A and getting to B is obvious. But it is when we look at the intermediate steps, when we look at the failures, that we get to appreciate the most sophisticated results. That is to say, to get from D&D to a good D&D game, certain missteps had to be taken, attempts had to be made that did not work very well, and one of the first attempts was in fact pretty weak. That is to say, D&D role-playing games, the idea of a game with a strong story had just emerged from war games, and it wasn't obvious where it would go. It wasn't obvious that at the end we would really need to jettison most of that or all of the wargaming element, and that the new innovative story, the new innovative element, the dominant element that would make RPG so fantastic, that is the individual element, could walk on its own leg, couldn't make it by its own. Clearly wasn't obvious at the times of Lankhmar that adventures did not need the wargaming element and would have a hard time getting together with. It's not that it's impossible to do so, but it's very hard, and it's very easy to come up with a mess, and it is much easier to have a war game that does the war game stuff well and an RPG type of game, story-oriented game that does that thing well. That is to say, to me, this game is a failure, but it's an interesting failure because it shows me that it wasn't obvious at all in the early days of wargaming and in the early attempts, the early days of RPG, and the early attempts to bring story back from the RPG into the board games. It wasn't obvious at all the direction that one should go. This is a game that tries to still stay close to the origin of RPGs, which is war games, fails considerably to do so, but it's interesting to me. It's interesting to me because it gives me more of an appreciation of what happens at the end of a process when you have other designers that figure out what matters and give you the story, and they get rid of the wargaming element, which may be probably at the time one of the most interesting elements, one of the draws. It was a popular hobby at the time. So you had to be courageous, you had to be brave, you had to give up what could have been a draw towards your game, which is the wargaming element, and just go for you're a hero, that is the dungeon, those are the monsters, go fight. So, a hybrid between wargaming and adventure that really does a poor job of combining the two. Lankhmar, interesting for historical reasons. I would not recommend it to anyone who is interested in playing a good game. Even the hardcore fans, they may pick it up just to have it in their collection of paraphernalia that have to do Fafhrd and the Grey Mouser, if they are hardcore fans of Leiber's work. There are a couple of interesting things historically, again, when you read the rulebook, for example, to see that in the rulebook the terms role-playing game wasn't in there yet. So actually when the rulebook is talking about D&D at the end, when they are advertising other products by TSR, Dungeons & Dragons is called a free-form fantasy game. A volume set of rules. So it's not a game, it's rules. So there's still the idea of miniatures for free-form fantasy games using paper and pencil and miniature figures. So basically they're talking about Dungeons and Dragons as free-form miniature wargaming. Again, shows you that a lot of work had to be done before the potential of role-playing games in Dungeons and Dragons was fully tapped and developed.